We are about to begin our investigation into the history of the Knights Templars in the local area. We've been joined by Tony McMahon, who's the author of this epic book on the history of the Templars. So let's just get straight into it, Tony. What our plan is locally, there's a bunch of stories about the Knights Templars, particularly there's stories about hidden tunnels and treasure. What we'd like to do is get information about the order from yourself and build from there and see what we can learn. So if you could, who were the Templars? What were they about?
Yeah, I mean, just to kick off, I'm having bookshelf envy here. I'm
No,
trying to figure out who's got the coolest bookshelf. I mean, you've got a lot of, you're a bit
I think
knick-knack
you win,
crazy as
man.
well.
Tony, yeah, I think it's you, I'm afraid.
Oh, is that the
I
Justice
can see
League at the
three
top?
there. Do so.
Yeah, you've got a whole extra bookcase.
Oh, right. You haven't got action figures for the band, I take it.
Not yet.
That is a
We're
good
we're
shout.
hoping once we get signed, we're hoping to build up to the action figure market.
Okay. All right, the Knights Templar then. So these were like, interrupt me anytime as well, because otherwise I'm half Irish, so I'll talk forever. Okay.
Okay.
Also half Portuguese, so I'll talk forever. But so basically, that they were kind of like holy warriors. They were involved in the Crusades. I call them the shock troops of the Crusades. Most knights at that time, they like turned up in the Crusades. They were like, aristocratic men who turned up. They did a bit of fighting, and then they said, "God, is that the time? I must get back to my estates in France." And then they pop off. Whereas the Knights Templar, they were there all year round, and they were celibate. They kind of went for the lifestyle of a monk, basically, but they weren't actually monks, but they observed all the vows. So they led this really hard life. Actually, it was kind of military drills, prayer, about five, six prayer times during the day, lots of military drills, and then their kind of rule was first into battle and last out. So they kind of charged in. They had this uniform, the kind of white mantle with the red cross,
Mhm.
and they were really popular. A lot of young men in the Middle Ages said, "We want to be not just like them, we want to be in them. We want to be a member of the Knights Templar." And they were incredibly popular, incredibly effective until it all went wrong. But we'll get to that in a moment.
So what made them so popular for nobles and such to join?
Yeah, well, so basically, you have to go right back to it's the year 1095, and there are these reports coming through that Christians are being attacked in the East. We don't know if this was all true or not, but it was these reports coming through, and the Pope basically said, "I'm going to launch this new type of war called a crusade," and everybody shouted, "Deus Vult, God wills it." And basically, this launched the first crusade, and these crusaders, these Christian warriors, went to the Middle East and they took Jerusalem and all the holy places, set up these new kingdoms, carved out these kingdoms in the Middle East. But they found it really hard to hold on to them. And this is why the Templars came into existence. And the other thing that was happening was that Christian pilgrims thought, oh, yeah, now that we're in control of Jerusalem, now that Christians are running Jerusalem, these crusaders, it'll be easy to go on pilgrimage. But they were turning up and they were being attacked by bandits on the roads into Jerusalem. So the Templars said, well, we'll do two things. One, we'll protect the pilgrims coming into Jerusalem. And two, we'll go and fight all these battles that need to be fought to hold on to, the new kingdom of Jerusalem and all these little kingdoms that were set up. So yeah, they were kind of like they were the kind of answer to a problem that had arisen. The Christians had carved out these kingdoms, but holding on to them was a big problem. So along came the Knights Templar to help them do that.
So could you maybe give us, because obviously I think the Templars arise with the Crusades.
Yeah.
What was the situation geopolitically in the Holy Land at this time?
Oh, that's a okay. It's good
And
for
I
my
realize that's a huge question.
no, 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 no. So it's interesting. So first of all, what had happened? What was really worrying that you almost have to go back to the Roman Empire. Remember the Roman Empire? Roman Empire ruled, Middle East, North Africa, Europe, and the Persians ruled the East. Then in the 600s came this new religion of Islam. It came out of the Arabian desert. and it took over what we call the Levant, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, which had all been run by the Roman Empire, remember? So this new religion, there was this thing called the Caliphate. It all became Muslim, including Jerusalem, Bethlehem, all these places. And in fact, these Muslim armies even came into Europe. They took what's now Spain and Portugal. They went right up into France. They took Sicily, southern Italy, and so on. So there was this kind of dividing line between Christianity and Islam, not just in the Middle East, right the way across southern Europe. Um, and so there was a lot of tensions in that, obviously. And so we get the situation then, 400 years after that, that the Byzantine Empire, which was this Christian empire in the east, was under attack from a new wave of Muslim invaders called the Seljuk Turks. And they're the ones that the Pope said were carrying out atrocities. They were also attacking other Muslims, by the way, but they're also attacking the Byzantine Empire. So the Pope says, right, we've got to, this is, I'm not having any more of this. We're going to have this thing called the Crusade. And it just seemed to chime with the time. I don't know what it is, but it was also, I think what the church was trying to do, they were trying to channel a lot of the aggression of European knights into something a bit more noble, because they did spend a lot of time murdering and beating each other up, rather pointlessly. And I think the Pope just thought, wouldn't it be great if we used all this testosterone, all this energy, in medieval Europe and directed it that way towards, towards Muslims in the Middle East. And that's basically what happened. And it just caught the mood. And these very kind of charismatic preachers. There was one guy called Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He used to say, he used to hold up the cross and say, "Take the cross," and thousands would come, and they'd take bits of his garments as well. They want to keep a bit of Saint Bernard's cloak and all this sort of thing. But they took the cross, they went off to the Middle East. A lot of them died, and you can imagine as well. I always think, God Almighty, wearing all that armor in the hot Middle East, but that's what they did, and these tough drills and so on. And yeah, that's basically what happened.
Some of
could I
these
just oh, sorry, Sally, go on. You're right.
no, just an incidental note. I heard that some of these knights had as a belief or perhaps as a vow just to not wash too much. And if you add that to the thought that these people were marching for about a month at a time, if not more,
Yeah.
you find yourself with some real stinky fighting warriors defending the cross. Sounds
Well,
pretty.
the Templars had a rule book, and it was pretty tough stuff. I mean, one of them that always makes me laugh is that they had to sleep basically with a light on, in order not to do what all young men do when the bedroom doors closed. So basically, they weren't allowed to marry, they weren't even allowed to pleasure themselves, and basically, yeah, they were told, they had to keep their hair short, they had to keep, they had no ornamentation, no bling, they weren't allowed to gossip. They weren't allowed to laugh. They weren't allowed to gamble. They weren't allowed to hunt.
What?
And yeah,
So they
and
weren't the
Very
most
rural,
fun
wasn't
guys.
no, no. I mean, it was very, and there was a guy called the Draper
That's
who
hilarious.
went round and basically enforced this. Any letters from home had to be, vetted. It was a bit like being in prison in some ways, and a very hierarchical structure. You've got the Grand Master at the top, and then these provincial masters in different parts of Europe. So very structured, very disciplined, and and also quite secretive. And of course, that's why people, a lot of rumors start to spread. These guys are too good to be true. What's really going on? But yeah, to come to your point, they probably were very stinky.
Yeah.
So this brings up, I'm sort of hopping to the side here a little bit, but where generally when we think of knights of this period, we're looking at guys that, lots of ornamentation, very fancy looking, but the Templars weren't like this at all, were they?
No, it was absolutely. In fact, this guy, Saint Bernard, who was their kind of spiritual advisor, he hated all those, like gargoyles in church. Those kind of like hated all that. Hated all the kind of like little things they drew into Bibles at those time, little creatures, and like hated all that. No, no, everything had to be plain, plain, simple. And if a Templar turned up with like a bridle for the horse that had kind of, he had to paint it over. Any ornamentation had to paint it over. It had to be simple, and they all had to look exactly the same. But that was part of the psychological effect on the enemy, because you got to imagine the enemy's kind of used to this kind of like a load of colourful knights, not really charging in any order, going charging them. Now they've got this band of knights in square formation, white mantles, not saying anything, no cheering, nothing, just moving at them. And that's part of the terrifying kind of, that's a terrifying thing for the enemy. They just thought these guys they're not really human, are they? There's something weird, and they've got this massive commitment to Christ, and they don't go home, and they don't have women, and they don't hunt. What the hell's wrong with them? So they just strike fear into the enemy, because they were a bit weird.
They were a very good military order in that. I remember one quote from your book where a guy describes them as moving as one body into
Yes.
the enemy. So which suggests to me that other knights of the time were not organized in this way.
Oh yeah, I mean, to be honest, it's sometimes, well, when I talk about some of the battles that were lost, I mean, sometimes it's just chaotic. Medieval warfare must have just been complete and utter chaos. And you've got, a lot of these armies, you had French, German, Italians, they probably didn't speak to each other, they probably didn't like each other, they had their own commanders. The number of battles that are lost because commanders weren't speaking to each other, they couldn't even speak to each other, they didn't understand each other's languages, and so on. Um, so the Templars were really something, something new, something different, and this rigid command structure as well, and a lot of kind of discipline as well. If knights disobeyed the orders, there's even a story of one knight who was accused of fraud being starved to death in a cell.
Wow.
Um, yeah, so don't mess.
So, sorry to interject. You were saying that a lot of armies were speaking different languages. From what I've looked at, quite a lot of the Knights Templar came from different regions of Europe as well.
Yeah.
So did they have to sort of learn a certain language or like conform to
I mean,
certain routines?
Latin probably would be a common language.
Latin, the church Latin would have been, but I think what they did though, which I think probably overcame that, is their drills. That they kind of a lot of the knights and they didn't drill together. They didn't. I mean, some of them didn't bother drill. I guess they just picked up a sword and ran into battle. But there was this strict drill. So I think even if Templars couldn't, as you say, if they couldn't understand each other, they drilled together. And the discipline and like they often said about the Romans that what was it their drills were like battles and their battles were like drills. And I think the Templars were like that as well. Every time they went into battle, it was actually like a training exercise. And they trained so much that they knew, and that's where I
Yeah,
think they didn't need to speak because they just knew, like a machine,
cool.
really. They knew exactly
Like
what.
training all the variables that could come in war. Yeah,
Yeah,
nice.
yeah. And that there's even rules about, oh God, the size of their tent pegs and, you know, I mean, they had everything, everything was like rules, 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 right down to but I think precisely because of that, because if there was any problems with communication, then, they'd know what to do.
To the modern mind, the order you're describing does not sound particularly appealing, as a young man. Obviously, during this time period, it was very appealing. This
Mm.
idea of a monastic life, at least for some people, a monastic life where you're basically going to the Holy Land to fight people. What made this appealing to these people?
So I think, funnily enough, some of them, I mean, some of them might come from, you can imagine that time people were dirt poor, dirt poor. I mean, the ones who joined, normally the knights came from, wealthier backgrounds, and what they call the sergeants, the grunts in the Templar Order um, came from more modest backgrounds. The ones who came from more modest backgrounds, the reason they would have joined something like the Templars or even the monastic orders was probably to get a pillow, and sheets and what things that were regarded as luxuries. But but for the knights, I do think this was an age of faith. This was an age of deep religious faith, and this was the pilgrimage, but with a lot of testosterone attached. This was an armed pilgrimage. And remember, these are people who may have been dead in their 30s and 40s. These were people who worried about, am I going to get to heaven, or am I going to hell? And people genuinely believe that. I think sometimes we don't appreciate that people really did believe that one day, sooner than, most of us are going to die, they were going to die. And were they going to wake up and find themselves in hellfire or in heaven, heavenly glory? And so, you know, the idea of kind of like going into battle, dying, and then waking up in heaven because you've done the right thing, weirdly, is very appealing,
Yeah,
And I
it's
think
like spiritual insurance.
completely. And the popes would often say, they'd often say to people, if you join the Crusades, if you join the Templars, you'll get this number of years wiped off your time in purgatory. They were called
Wow.
indulgences. And the popes would actually say this to encourage people to go into the Crusades. They say, you'll get 240 years off your time in purgatory if you join this crusade.
And if
And,
you're
and
taking that seriously, that must be extremely appealing. Like
Mhm.
these, like you said, these are people that live in maybe 30, 40 years. 250 years in purgatory is like what, 5 times their lifespan. It's like a unimaginable, borderline, horrific punishment, I would imagine. Even if it's
Mm.
purgatory and not hell, it's hard to wrap your head around.
well, you've got to think as well, if you go into an English church today, all the walls are whitewashed, and it's all quite simple because that's the Protestant Reformation, that 500 years. Before that, sometimes they get discovered underneath the whitewash. These churches were covered in, painting. Even the cathedrals, were covered in paintings. They weren't like how you see today plain stone. There was painting everywhere, and the paintings were often of hellfire, Judgment Day, and people, couldn't read. They couldn't read the Bible because it was in Latin, and they weren't supposed to read it anyway. So what they did when they were in church is they looked around and they just saw devils, sticking tripods into people and that sort of thing. And that's what was in people's heads. There's no TV. TV was the church, and that's the life you led.
A lot of the indoctrination of the Christian or Catholic Church would be through attending mass and seeing what the paintings were there and the stories of the paintings. So yeah, absolutely. It's
Yeah,
interesting that the Protestants just said, nope, we're going to get rid of that.
well, because they wanted the word of God, and they translated the Bible and did all those things that didn't exist at the time of the Templars. Because the Bible was in Latin, it was chained to the lectern at the front, and only the priest read it. The priest was the educated person in the room,
Mm.
and everybody else was like, okay, this is your dose of God in a language you can't even understand. Now get back in the fields and start working again. That was it. Until next Sunday.
And if I could just
So,
j jump in
sorry,
there
go
quick.
ahead, Ben.
No, sorry, Andy, you're right. Basically, going back to an earlier question about the geopolitical events at the time period. Um, One question I've got is, would it make sense then, the conspiracies surrounding the Templars about the relics, because they eventually did have success in Jerusalem? Would it make sense to think that there wouldn't be many relics there for them to see because it would be hundreds of years after Islamic sort of invasions of that area and before that Roman occupation anyway? So would you say there's any other solid evidence that the Templars did have any access to holy relics from Jerusalem, like obviously the Ark of the Covenant and any other interpretations of the Holy Grail?
Yeah.
Sorry,
So
just before you answer, Tony, could you also tell us what are the relics? Because there's the obvious ones, the Grail, the
Yeah.
Ark, but
Yeah.
maybe if you could tell us what, there's a whole list of them.
Yeah. So basically, in the Catholic Church, not in other branches of Christianity, but the Catholic Church, kind of like bits of saints and bits of Jesus even or Mary or whatever are kind of revered. And in the Middle Ages, it was big business. If you were a monastery that claimed to have a bits of, let's say, five, six, seven, 10 saints, you could attract
Mm.
lots of pilgrims. It was big business. I was in Glastonbury last year, where the music festival is, and there's a ruined abbey there, and they claimed to have King Arthur, Guinevere, Saint Patrick. They had the Holy Grail was buried nearby, and blah 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 blah.
Mm.
Everybody wanted top relics, and these relics, the most prized relics, normally are to do with the Passion of Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus. So you got the crown of thorns. Everybody wanted the crown of thorns. You've got the Holy Grail, the cup that Jesus used at the Last Supper, but also the story went that Joseph of Arimathea used it to catch some of his blood from the wound in his side at the crucifixion.
Whoa. No way.
You got the what else? The holy sponge, believe it or not. The sponge that was used to
Whoa.
that you
To
can still see
feed
that
vinegar,
around. Huh? The
to
wine
feed
and vinegar.
vinegar.
Wine and vinegar, yeah. Well, they actually had the holy sponge, the pillar to which he was tied to, the whip that was used to whip him.
Oh, okay. Right.
All of these things were like, relics that, and if you go to Rome today, some of those relics. I went there last year, and I even saw the finger of Saint Thomas. Doubting Thomas, who stuck his finger in the wounds because
Well,
he didn't. Yeah, they've got the finger in Rome. Anyway, so um, the, we don't have written evidence that says the Templars went looking for these things, but we do know that they had relics, and we do know that they used those relics to raise money because the Templars were a very good money-raising machine, by the way.
mm,
They had kind of farms and agribusinesses, all over Europe, and they raised a lot of money. And we do know they use relics to raise money. What a lot of people have thought over the years is that they deliberately base themselves on what's called the Temple Mount, which you can see in Jerusalem today, which was once the foundation of a massive Jewish temple that was destroyed first by the Babylonians, and that's when the Ark of the Covenant went missing, and then by the Romans. They built a second temple and it got destroyed by the Romans, never rebuilt again. But the Templars insisted on being based on the Temple Mount. And what people believe happened is that they burrowed down to find these secret treasures, that would have been under the temple in Jerusalem. The Ark of the Covenant isn't one of the passion relics of Jesus. It relates to the Jews, and it's been missing since 500 odd BC. It once, well, from Indiana Jones, it was this golden casket that was believed to have magical power, and it housed the Ten Commandments, the rod of Moses, the rod of Aaron, and some of the manna that fell from heaven. But it went missing 2,500 years ago. Nobody's ever seen it. Now, some people have argued that the reason the Templars were crushed, and this is where we drift into mystery more than history here, the reason the Templars were crushed is because they actually found some of these relics, and that they were, as it were, they became too powerful, and the Pope had to crush them. Now, we are going into conspiracy theory mode here and kind of mysteries, but that is the kind of view, and especially the Holy Grail. That has become very associated with the Templars, and I'll tell you why very quickly. It's because that at the time the Templars existed, the legends of King Arthur began to be, written down by people like Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von
oh,
Eschenbach, Robert of Boron, and Wolfram von Eschenbach mentions a Grail castle, a castle where the Holy Grail was kept, which was guarded by, he calls them the Templiers. And remember, this is contemporary of the Templars. So what people believe is that he's referring to the Templars, that he was writing there in his story saying the Templars were guarding the Holy Grail. And ever since, people have said, aha, they must have had the Templar Grail. They must have had the Holy Grail, sorry. And that's why they got crushed.
So one of the things I found interesting about this is that what I didn't know before reading your book is that some people think they had the heads of um, John the Baptist. Am I correct here?
Yes.
So, so there's also, I mean, you touched on it, but there's also relics which are really, essentially mummified remains of
insane. Wow.
saints, which is a strange thing to revere in a way. Also, the other thing I think we're kind of getting into a little bit is there's sort of parallel views of how the Templars attained their power and wealth, and one of them you just touched on is this idea that they gained access to a lot of holy relics, but the other idea is that they were just really good financiers. Perhaps you could touch on the financial and banking side of the Templars for us.
Yeah, well, I started life as a financial journalist. I know, but I did, 30 years ago. So I'm actually quite interested in Templars and money. And the thing is, when I researched it, and I did a chapter on it in the book, is the Templars were really, really good at making money. And I thought, maybe this is overstated. But the more I looked into it, it wasn't just, they had a system of bank checks for a start. So the Templars had these commanderies, they call them, all over Europe. They were like farming estates, yeah, where they lived, but also, and if you join the Templars, let's say you join the Templars in some village in France, you might never leave that village in France. You might join the local commandery, and basically your job is to look after pigs and cows. and maybe make butter and so on. But these things made money that was then channeled to the Holy Land. So there were a lot of people in the Templar Order who were just working on farms basically, or doing small scale kind of medieval industry. And so they made a lot of money that way. They also got into money lending, which is really interesting because in the Middle Ages, only the Jews were supposed to be able to lend money because making interest on money was a sin, the church said. But somehow the Templars twisted that a little bit. I also found out the Templars used to go around as enforcers for money lenders. So basically, um, for example, the Italians who got into banking very early, they would basically say to to one of their creditors, "I'm lending you this amount of money, but some armed gentlemen called the Knights Templar will be round to pick up the regular payments." So they got into that as well. But they got so good at bookkeeping and accountancy that even on occasion ended up running the state finances for
Oh,
France and England at different times. So they kind of became like, I don't know, the Treasury or the Federal Reserve, I mean, in medieval terms. So they
that's
got
crazy.
really good at making money. And then the other thing I was going to say was that they developed this bank check system where you could basically, instead of taking all your money on crusade, we are bound to get robbed, a big chest of money, the way most people had to operate in the Middle Ages. Instead, you deposited some in a Templar commandery in London, say. They wrote a little chitty saying, "You have deposited this amount of money with us in London." And there was a secret code on it or something like that. And they then went off on crusade to Jerusalem and they could draw down on it, while they're in Jerusalem. And no, that kind of idea of bank checks, that was revolutionary in the Middle Ages. Nobody had ever heard of that before.
So how, just so I'm clear on how this works, essentially, let's say the king in England wants to send finances to the Holy Land. Essentially, what would happen is the king would deposit X amount in a local Templar um, temple, I guess, and
Yeah,
then they would send a note to other Templars in the Holy Land saying the king
yeah.
deposited X amount, you need to release X amount to his troops in Jerusalem, say.
Yeah, and there's even an example I give in the book. The French king was actually on crusade, having a really rotten time. He had to hide behind a tree while he was shot up by loads of arrows in a battle that went badly wrong, and he needed money. And it was the other way around. He actually sent a message back to Paris saying to his treasurer in Paris, "Deposit this money quickly with the Templars so I can draw it out here." And the Templars went along with this and they arranged it. And of course, it was great for them because they had the king by the doodahs, basically. They were able to, which of course proved to be their undoing in the end because the king.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about this. I mean, were they not at times funding opposite sides of conflicts in Europe? So, the Templars in France would be funding the French king, and the Templars in England would be funding the British king.
So they went. So it's an interesting point because the Templars were never supposed to take sides in disputes between different Christian rulers. I think it's something that's not been written about enough and researched enough. I think they did on occasion. They certainly ended up on different sides from the Hospitallers. There was a war between Genoa and Venice where the Templars were back in Venice and the Hospitallers were back in Genoa. That definitely happened. So these two rival military orders used to, bust up against each other. Um, but I think, yeah, I think them. It's difficult to understand because England and France were at war a lot at this time. The King of England, because the King of England actually ruled a big chunk of what's now France, and that didn't make the King of France very happy. So they were often fighting, and yet there were Templars, as you say, in England and Templars in France. You got to imagine were they a bit conflicted? I think they must have been. It must have been very difficult. But then that's where the overall structure, the overarching structure, and having this one Grand Master overseeing everything. I imagine the idea was that would override any kind of, national divisions, and it would all be kind of referred upwards, if there were any conflicts.
Could it work the other way round, like hiring a mercenary kind of force? Because one of the places we're going to explore is Bulldog, which is supposedly a town set up by the Knights Templar, gifted by the king. So would this have been sort of like, I want some favor with you guys, because if your other mate comes, maybe you can remember that I sorted you something sweet out here.
Well, it's interesting. Yeah, do you know Baldock? There's an interesting story there because in Hertfordshire, isn't it?
That's it. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
That's where we're
and
exploring.
and there's a story that it's actually a corruption of Baghdad. And the idea was that this is the story. You can look this up, but the story was that Baghdad was the richest city in the Middle East. It was the capital of the Abbasid Muslim Caliphate, and that the Templars called Baldock because they hoped it would one day be as rich as Baghdad. I don't know. A lot of people say it's just
Not quite.
all oak, right?
It's
So,
charming.
but you'll find that theories out there. But definitely, there was, I mean the Templars, well, you get the nobility giving money to the Templars because they believe in the Templar ideal, but undoubtedly as well, it's also there's a banking relationship as well going on there, and maybe land might have been given by people who owed money to the Templars. They just said, well, I know you owe you a lot of money. If I give you this parcel of land over here, can we just can we just cancel it out? And actually, one thing the Templars were very good at, they were very good at developing scrubby land that nobody wanted. They were very good farmers, and sometimes what would happen is a noble would say, "Well, I've got this crappy piece of land over here. I don't know what to do with it. I'll give it to the Templars, and we'll work out a little deal between us." So there's a lot of that going on.
Is there anything about America in this? Because I've heard a lot of tales about have they discovered America before Columbus and stuff like this. I don't know if you've heard any of that or looked into it.
Oh yeah. So basically, well, my next book is called Downfall of the Templars, and it's all about the trials and what's supposed to have happened to them afterwards. So basically, you get 1307. The King of France turns on the Templars, and this 200-year story goes sour, basically. So King Philip IV of France, basically turns on the Knight Templar, and he gets the Pope, who's a kind of like a bit of a puppet Pope by this stage. He's got him under control, Clement, to go along with this. And for 5 years, the Templars are basically arrested, tortured, and then eventually the last Grand Master is executed, is burned at the stake. But
Well,
worse ways to be executed in 1314. Him and another senior Templar burned at the stake near Notre Dame. You can go to Paris, there's a plaque there. But a lot of people
well,
thought, well, hang on a moment. So what happened to the Templars? They just fizzle out. So one of the theories is that there were these secret arrest warrants that were sent out all over France to be served on Friday the 13th, 1307. This is when all the Templars
well,
were rounded up. Yeah, that's why Friday the 13th is unlucky. So they all get put in prison. But some people believe the Templars were tipped off about these arrest warrants, and they managed to get a lot of their treasure on carts down to a port called La Rochelle. And from there, different people have different ideas. Did they go north to Scotland or did they go
mm,
south to Portugal? Because Portugal was very friendly to the Templars because the Templars had fought with the Portuguese to push the Muslims out of Portugal. Or did they go up to Scotland because Robert the Bruce, if you remember from Braveheart, had been excommunicated by the Pope for killing one of his rivals in front of a church altar. I mean, in the church, which you definitely weren't supposed to do. So the theory
yeah,
is that the Templars went up there, and while they were in Scotland, there's all sorts of theories. It all gets very rich in theories at this point. That they befriended a family called the Sinclairs, who had actually served with the Templars in the Holy Land. And the theory goes, and a lot of people, you can imagine, agree and disagree with this theory, that the Sinclairs helped the Templars take their treasure in the direction of the Americas and reached Nova Scotia in the 1390s. Now, you might say, where's the evidence for that? So, people who believe that theory say that the evidence is at Rosslyn. This chapel in Rosslyn features in the Da Vinci Code movie and book, if you remember. And they say that there are carved images in the stonework of Rosslyn Chapel of maize and aloe vera, plants that basically did not exist in Europe until Columbus. So the theory is that the Sinclairs who built Rosslyn Chapel and the
yeah,
Templars got to the New World and then basically depicted what they'd found there in this chapel. There's no evidence, if you're asking for any documents or anything that prove this, nothing. There's nothing at all. And then, of course, we get into the whole theory that the Templars went to a place called Oak Island in Nova Scotia and buried their treasure there. And there's
yeah.
been a multi-season documentary series on the History Channel, obviously pursuing that and looking for the treasure. So yeah, there is.
I'm guessing that they haven't found the treasure yet.
They found bits and pieces. They get very
Hmm,
excited when they
interesting.
find a coin or a nail or something like that. They haven't I haven't found big chests of treasure, but they're still there digging away. And of course, there's also people believe there's something called the Newport Tower in Massachusetts. Some people argue that it's a Templar tower. Some people say no, it's not. It's a 17th century windmill. There's another one called the Westford Knights, which some people say is a glacial striations on a rock, and other people say they can make out the image of a medieval knight, and they think it's a tomb of a Templar in the New World. But you have to take all this with a pinch of salt. But I think the reason these theories have proliferated is because the destruction of the Templars. People at the time were shocked. They were shocked that the Templars were suddenly accused of heresy, devil worship, sodomy as well. All sorts of things that
So
Well,
does it
it's
come down to the really defining factors about after the Grand Masters got burnt at the stake? Does it come down to the fact that they would have only had to rely on potentially being tipped off about arrest warrants for the idea of them to escape? So it could have only been at that point. It's hard, I imagine, to quantify how many of them were like hunted down at the time. Would you say thousands, or would it be hundreds?
Well, we know no. One thing we do know that it's something like 500 people were arrested immediately because the
Right.
trials are
Mm.
actually really well documented. So we know that the Templars were arrested en masse, and this would have been a real shock in any society. I mean, you got to think in relation to the population of time. That's
Mm.
thousands of people being arrested all at once, and the trials went on for years. And we know from the trial documents still exist, and we know the Templars were tortured. One of them even turned up in court with his feet bones in his pocket because they covered his feet in fat and set them on fire. So he
Wow.
came up with his toe bones and said, "Thanks, thanks a lot."
And is that from well, the Christians would be doing that punishment because they would
that was
be
the king.
deeming them as heretics?
Oh, well, that's the King of France. Yeah,
Wow.
the King of France,
Wow.
basically. So basically, in the arrest warrants, what the King of France and the Pope said is that we thought for 200 years the Templars were Christian warriors, but no, they weren't. The Templars were worshipping demons. The Templars were kissing each other on the base of the spine. And this is actually what it says in the arrest warrants.
Wow.
It even says in the arrest warrant they crucified Christ a second time, you know, and
Wow.
people
Sounds
are
like Game of Thrones. All
Oh,
this, like,
well, I think a lot of it is influence, but
yeah,
people
influence
believe
about
it. They didn't believe it, and it took a lot. They really had to hammer the message
it.
home and get force Templars to sign confessions by torturing the hell out of them. And
Wow.
obviously that they were accused of worshiping. They got one of them to confess to worshiping a demon called Baphomet, um,
Mm.
and also this thing about John, the head of John the Baptist. Also, the head of Huda Payne, the first Grand Master, they claimed was worshipped, and this head used to speak to them and issue orders to them, all sorts of weird stuff.
Wow.
But that is all documented. That happened.
Wow,
There's
so
no
there's a decent evidence then that this was super substantial. So I guess the question that I asked was basically to allude to the fact of the myths being that they could have potentially survived by going to that port and then going potentially, or maybe both. Some of them went to Scotland, some of them went to Portugal. Would you say that it's basically like a slim chance of that potentially even happening? Or would you say that because there's so much literature around the myths that it could have been, plausible?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think Scotland is I think it's a harder one to prove, although there's more been written about Scotland. And by the way, traditionally Freemasons, bought into a lot of these stories because they believe
Yeah.
they're the descendants. Although they often say that a lot of Freemasons say, no, we don't. We're just being allegorical. But a lot of Masons in the past have written that they are the descendants of the Knights Templar. But in Portugal, the Templars weren't destroyed. They were rebranded by the king and they were
Wow.
turned into a new order called the Order of Christ and they continued. So the Templars did continue
Interesting.
in
Yeah.
Portugal. And the Order of Christ went on to lead the navigation that led to the discovery of the New World. It was the Order of Christ that discovered Brazil. So in a weird way, the Templars did continue. In
Wow.
Portugal, in Spain, they became the Order of Montesa and continued that way. So, and there are theories as well that did some of the Templars become pirates? Did they become mercenaries? because they couldn't have just melted away, and you've got armed men basically who've been, highly trained, who are also very pissed off. You know, so what did they do? You know,
Mhm.
Well,
I mean, surely they defended themselves when the Pope and and the Church started to criticize them and judge them. Really, no, like I mean, that
well,
was some pretty serious accusation right there.
yeah.
yeah, and I think that's why they went for. I think that's why the King of France went for a surprise attack. He issued the warrants about a month before, and it was all done in total secrecy because, he had an armed body of men on his in his kingdom who were not accountable to him. They're directly accountable to the Pope because the Templars only their ultimate line manager is the Pope.
Well,
Even though the king had the Pope under control, that wasn't, it's still kind of unnerving.
mm,
And it's a good question. Did the Templars fight back? We don't have a lot of, we only have one piece of evidence from my knowledge of where they did fight back, and that was late on in France, where a Templar basically said, if you don't release us, basically, there's 1,000 people ready to march on this courtroom. Um, but from what we know, it didn't happen. I think by degrees the state broke them, but I mean I think there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge, and like you say, it's kind of you think, come on, they must have fought back, but a lot of them were rounded up very quickly. I think that's why the King of France acted very quickly to get them.
Well, funny enough, another site we're trying to visit is apparently there's a Knights Templar cave in Royston, which is very far north in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
And I think the theory that goes along with this cave was it was around this period and it was some Knights Templar escaping and essentially hiding in a cave. Anything you could elaborate on with any sort of like actions like
Well,
that?
have you been to Royston Cave?
Yeah, yeah, I have, and it's it's kind of like a cone, it's like a beehive type shaped thing, and the carvings there are very interesting, and it's you know, everywhere you look where the Templars, had castles, fortifications, their commander is, they do seem to be very keen on tunnels. And some people have speculated, well, was this something to do with their initiation rituals? I mean, I've gone belly first into tunnels in Scotland that, for a program called America Unearthed, where we went to look at caves that the Templars were believed to have hidden in, after they fled to Scotland. That's one of the theories. And I think one of the theories about Royston is that that cave was where they had their initiation rituals. We do know that they had secret initiation rituals because during the trials, this is where they were accused of engaging in sexual acts with each other. And of course, that was meant to kind of discredit them. That was meant to discredit them, yeah. But it was accused of kisses on the lips, chest, and base of the spine. So base of the spine was the big thing. But of course, this may have been, because it was a standard issue charge to make against people in the Middle Ages was, you are a sodomite. When you wanted to
Well, this
discredit.
is something I wanted to ask you, Tony, is well, as we get to the end of the sort of mainline success of the Knights, there are all these accusations made of them, and they're to the modern eye at least, they seem fairly outlandish. Spitting on the crucifix, the strange kissing rituals, stuff like this.
Yeah.
How much? How seriously should we take it? Or rather, let me put another thought to you. It seems to me that if you were a king at this time, you might be pretty uncomfortable with having a bunch of heavily armed guys who answer to the Pope and not to you. And you need a way of getting rid of these guys eventually, especially when the Crusades are ending. So are these accusations purely inventions to discredit the Knights Templar? Should we throw out these ideas of heresies and so on?
So I've got this second book out this year. I'm gonna share with you exclusively an
Oh,
angle
thank you, sir.
thank you.
that actually came out of my research. So normally, most historians say, well, King Philip IV, he was fighting England at the time, which he was. He was fighting Edward I of England. He needs money. You need money to pay for wars. He'd already shut down the monasteries. He'd gone after the Jews. He'd gone after the Lombard merchants, these Italian merchants in Paris. So he just went after the Templars. But what I found in my research was that there were actually multiple trials going on at the same time, not just the Templars. He was also after a bunch of women preachers called the Beguines. He accused the Bishop of Troyes which is actually in the center of where the Templars originally came from. He accused the Bishop of Troyes of killing the Queen, who died in childbirth, through sorcery and had him on trial for years. And he then wanted to put a dead Pope, Boniface VIII, on trial for diabolism, simony, heresy, and all sorts of. In other words, he had multiple trials. They were quite similar, and they all kind of feature magic, sorcery, and so on. And I think King Philip genuinely believed this stuff. I think that he thought that the Templars, he wanted the money. You know, you can believe two things at once. He wanted the money,
Hmm.
but I think he also genuinely thought not only the Templars, but all these other people I've mentioned were all into magic. Now, think about it. A few decades later, what takes off in Europe? The witchcraft craze, the whole witch hunting
Mm.
mania that takes off in Europe. And in fact, the Pope after Pope Clement, Pope John, was obsessed with witch hunting. He even thought people were trying to smuggle voodoo dolls into the papal palace to kill him. And he put all sorts of people,
Wow,
he burnt another bishop to death for this. So I think my theory,
that's
right? Are you
crazy.
ready for this? My theory is that the Knights Templar really, this is the first witch trials. That the kind of a lot of the stuff we're gonna see for the next 200-300 years in Europe, we're seeing basically starting to come to the fore because the church and state they're getting their kind of theological knickers and twists, basically combining heresy, sodomy, witchcraft, magic, and so on. And you see this more and more and more in the decades that follow. So I think that yeah, I think the Templars were the first witches. How
All
about
right.
that?
And so, Tony, I wonder if we could get a little bit more local now. I realize 45 minutes has passed. If you need to get going, totally understand. But if you're good, I've got a couple more questions I'd
Go
like to
on, go
throw
on,
by you.
go on.
Okay, so getting more local, like I say, I guess the general question is, what do you know about Temple Dinsley, the Hertford tunnels that have been claimed? Or to give you a bit of context, the story goes that I think we're around 1307. There was a Templar um, a building called Temple Dinsley, and that when these guys were arrested, about different accounts have different versions. Some say four, some say six Templars were taken from Temple Dinsley to Hertford Castle. I wonder, and this is where a lot of our investigations centering on. And ideally, we want to try and find some of these alleged Templar tunnels, which there was actually a local news story that got a bit of that got wider press about 10 years ago, about, or at least allegations from locals in Hertford, that the Templars still existed and that they were continuing to meet in these tunnels, and that possibly even holy relics uh, are hidden in these tunnels. So I wonder, do you know anything about this? Could you give us a bit of information? What should we be looking for and thinking about when we do this?
So I don't know about those particular tunnels, but there are kind of similar, stories about the Templars. I mean, actually, in my mother's native country, Portugal, and Tomar, they believe that there are tunnels that link the castle to a church that's way, way away in the middle of town, and to another church. So it's like a triangle that then linked to another church where the local masters, were buried. Um, and you see these stories coming up over and over again of the Templars developing these tunnel networks. So I think what you need to find is basically what would have linked what why would they have been linking, why would they have been tunneling basically, and what are they linking? So you might want to look for churches that don't exist anymore, that are not there anymore. Where was their commandery? The local commandery. Maybe how does that relate to Royston? That's the kind of thing you have to kind of think, well, why would they, would they have been trying to link these different places? Because that's something that occurs a lot. I think it'd be really interesting to find out who were the Templars, the local Templars who were arrested. And like you say, I was in York earlier this year, and the local Templars there were taken to York Minster to the chapter house to be arrested. I was in Lincoln at Christmas, same kind of story. You find they rounded up the local Templars and then took them either to the local cathedral or for trial in the chapter house, or they took them to local castle, obviously to keep them under lock and key. Um, we think that the Templars in England weren't tortured to the same degree they were, but some of them were. And I think there's a lot that's still not known about that. You know, we tend to assume that we're English and we don't torture our Templars, but I don't think that's true. I think, and in fact, the Pope actually sent letters to England saying, "Get on with torturing the Templars. I need these confessions." And we know Pope Clement did send letters saying that. So, be interesting to find out the names of your local Templars, where they were held, where they tortured. Be amazing to find out if one was executed because that didn't, by and large, seem to happen. And then, yeah, in terms of the tunnels, we'll have a look at, I guess, think other examples of Templar tunnels, alleged Templar tunnels. And then, really, the question is, why would they have tunneled there in particular? Where are they trying to connect something that may not be there anymore? Because, you know, a lot of these Templar properties, of course, were demolished. They were sold off. You know who took a lot of the Templar properties were the Knights Hospitaller because they survived and they just nabbed a load of Templar properties. But then the Reformation, they were destroyed in England as well, and then
Oh,
Templar properties tended to be dismantled and turned up in mansion houses and God knows what else. So you need to find out what was there. You know,
But
get your old maps up.
we shouldn't dismiss these tunnel ideas out of hand then. There
No, not
are there are established histories and archaeological sites where we know. I mean, I guess Royston Cave is an obvious example, although I believe exactly who built that is still disputed.
Oh yeah, I mean they're all disputed, but you know, you look up Templar Tunnel, you'll find there's claimed Templar tunnels in Scotland, in the Middle East as well. Tomar's a good example though. I like the Tomar story in Portugal if you want to take an example because it's there they've done a lot of work on trying to find out what was connected to what, and those buildings are still there. They weren't destroyed because the Portuguese rebranded them as the Order of Christ. So the buildings, those medieval churches are still there. Whereas here, of course, they're not there. So you've got to find out what was actually the lay of the land. Um, but yeah, I mean, I would go for it.
Oh, so certainly we will, and we'll let you know if we find anything very compelling. I think Tom had a question. I don't know if you wanted to drop it about sort of the psychology of play in terms of the religious and the ethical side of things.
Yeah, so I think you kind of covered it earlier with like just saying how basically everyone was so devout that they more or less were so fearful of, heaven, hell, whatever. They'd basically do what they want. So you kind of covered it, but it was just like getting an idea of like, the Bible's meant to be about morality. We're still asking those questions today all the time, really, aren't we? I was just curious, like how it was justified culturally to do what they were doing and it be fine. I guess there was probably propaganda involved. Obviously, we're going back now to when they were still active, but yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I mentioned there was a very high profile monk called Bernard of Clairvaux, who I mentioned, yeah, who's a Cistercian abbot of an abbey called Clairvaux. And he said, yeah, the Templar idea is amazing. When you kill with the sword, you're killing evil, malicide, not homicide, he said, so you can go out and you can kill. And of course, there's plenty of examples as well of bishops who went into battle. I mean, at the Battle of Hastings, 1066, there was a bishop, Bishop Odo. Uh, he didn't use a sword, he used a club because somehow that was deemed to be more humane as a bishop. But so this mad bishop was going around the battlefield clubbing people to death. But bishops did go into battle, priests went into battle. One of
oh,
the popes was even seen once in full battle, battle dress. But not everybody thought it was moral and not everybody thought it was ethical. And there's actually a monk called Isaac of Stella, who I've written about, that's Stella Artois, the beer, Isaac of Stella. And he said, this is diabolic. There's nothing in the New Testament that says that we should be, arming up to spread the word of Jesus. And this is right at the beginning of the Templars, not at the end. This is at the beginning. And he said this has been inspired by the devil. He even said this has come from the fifth gospel. He said, this idea of using the sword to spread Christianity. And later on in the trials of the Templars, some people said, where did this idea of the sword, spreading the faith by the sword, Islam? yes, this proves that the Templars were always in league with Islam. That they use this kind of, even though the Templars have fought the Muslims, they then started to twist it to say, you see, they were always Muslims all along. They were in league with the enemy, blah blah blah. So not everybody bought into the idea of using the sword for Christ. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with it, and that's why I think people like Bernard of Clairvaux had to write a lot. He wrote a book called In Praise of the New Knighthood to argue the case, because a lot of Christians, like yourself, we might be thinking, hang on a moment, when did Jesus ever swing a sword or pick up a shield?
Yeah, it's as if "Thou shalt not kill" has become "Thou shalt not kill" the in-group. You know.
Well, I mean, the trouble, of course, that comes from the Old Testament as well. And I mean, that there was no difficulty if you go to the Old Testament, of course.
There's a little bit of killing in there, just a touch, just a small amount.
Even animals and children in some cases. I mean, but I think they struggled with the New Testament, but they got there in the end. They just twisted a lot of words to get there. But yeah.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
Oh, absolutely. And look, they had 200 years where, they did fight some amazing battles, the Templars, and they fought some incredible victories. But then the tide turned,
Well, I
and
wanted to ask you about this as well, actually. We've been talking a lot about sort of a broad view of the Templars. I wonder, what do you think the Templars, for lack of a better word, what were their coolest moments? What were their best moments? And what were their weakest and worst moments?
I mean, I think there's a siege called the Siege of Ascalon. There's another one called the Battle of Montgisard, around about the same time, where, they got it right, and they completely defeated the enemy. And people, when news of this came back, to the West, people thought, oh my God, they're invincible, they're amazing, I want to join. And then, unfortunately, they lost, of course, the Battle of Hattin. They had a very, and this is the guy who features in the movie Kingdom of Heaven. They had a very hot-tempered Grand Master called Gerard of Ridfort, who never seems to have taken advice. People say, I don't think we should. I think we're heavily outnumbered here. And he say, "Shut up! We're getting right in. We're gonna, we'll win this." And he got his knights massacred. And then at the Battle of Hattin, I mean, it's a disastrous defeat by Saladin, who was this great Muslim Saracen ruler. And shortly afterwards, they lose Jerusalem. They regain it briefly, and then they lose it again. But it's never quite the same. I mean, they've still got a base in the Holy Land for another 150 years or so, but it's never the same. And of course, once the Templars lose the Holy Land, people start saying, why exactly all that money they've still got, all those weapons? Right,
We're
and
paying you a lot, and what are you doing?
I don't like the service.
yeah, and tongues start wagging, and of course, then people start saying, because they're angry at them as well for losing the Holy Land, they start saying, "Oh, maybe they were always bad eggs. Maybe they were a rotten lot."
Kissing
These people haven't
spines.
changed.
Just a quick
So yeah,
question
it's
on just there quickly. Just would you say then, because you were saying that the rule book they had was very strict. Was secrecy very strict with them? Like you see in early Freemasonry, the idea of secrecy, which is adapted over time, but was it prevalent within the Knights Templar to be a secretive order?
Yeah, absolutely. You are not allowed to share any information outside of the order, and that's one of the things that got people very, very suspicious of them. But no, it was total secrecy. What went on in their chapter meetings, their initiation ceremonies,
Right.
and so on, was absolutely, you would be thrown out of the order or worse if you opened your mouth. But of
Right.
course, that's what got the rumor mill going, because people said, "Wow, they're not prepared to share what they're doing. What are they doing?"
Yeah, exactly. So maybe that in itself, rather than maybe potentially any mysterious conspiracies that they may have found or had, might be the be all and a potential end all of like the Knights Templar. Meaning that just the fact that they were a secretive order, rather than the fact that they may have got on to holy relics and the Holy Grail, because like we said, they were actually created hundreds of years after Islam had already been in these areas, and you would imagine they would have the Temple Mount they would have held for ages, wouldn't they? They would have seen the relics before the Templars even
But then a
arrived.
lot of people say, but hang on a moment, what about the Knights Hospitaller? They were secret as well, and they had a rule book too. Why weren't they
Mm,
crushed? And that's one of the big
yeah,
mysteries. Why were the Knights Templar specifically crushed and not the
good
Knights
point.
Hospitaller? What had the Knights Templar done that they that led to their, I mean, really brutal crackdown. I mean, really
Yeah.
brutal, being rounded up, being tortured in prison, and no mercy, and being held for years. I mean, by the time poor old Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, when he was burned at the stake, he was already by then he'd been in prison for 7 years, and he was already in his 70s, which was really old for somebody at that in those days. Amazing he survived that long. And the reason he got burned at the stake is he just said, you know what, that confession I made, nuts. I'm tearing it up. Because he'd had enough. He just
Yeah.
had enough, and he just went there. And the story that he cursed the king and the pope from the flames, and they died shortly afterwards. But what they put the Templars through, you got to wonder why. Why? What was
Well,
it about the Templars that made them subjected to that horror at
I
the end?
guess that's the heart of the question, then, isn't it? That's a good point to consider.
Well, that's what you got to go and find out now in
Yeah,
Hertfordshire.
yeah, definitely.
You got to find. Tell you what, everybody's looking for clues. Find that. If you turn up something, there's always something turning up every so often. So don't. I was in Temple Combe the other day, where a woman found an image of Jesus in the 1940s that has caused excitement ever since. It's believed to be proof that they had the Shroud of Jesus, what's now called the Shroud of Turin at one point. I'm not going to open that discussion because that'll go on. But that kind of like, so, there's still stuff to be discovered. And, in your uh, investigations, don't rule out, especially in an area that's rich in Templar history, don't rule out you might find something.
Yeah, it's about using your way. Like you said, look for the stuff. If there's a triangle, old places, it's about there
Well,
must
this
be
is
some
what I was going
logic.
to ask. So left field, but is there anything in like Templar town planning you can maybe fill us with that might give us some sort of like some stuff to look out for around town that might be like a sign that we're on the right track?
I think you've got to find out. I think you've got to go back to those. I mean, maybe ask a local historian. You've got to find out what was there, what was above ground. I mean, I said obviously places called Temple. I mean, I was in Temple Combe the other day, and the church that was there when the Templars were there, is still there. But then I found out that actually half the town was owned by a convent and the other half by the Templars. So you got to find out what was going on, and of course a lot of it
Mm.
now is under the surface, but that's why you got to dig, basically.
Take a
Yeah,
metal
yeah.
detector as well.
So I wondered if we could finish on sort of like two or three things quickly. One is if you could, we touched on it, but we didn't spend too much time there. So it's what can you tell us about Temple Dinsley, and what can you tell us about Baldock? And then finally, just to finish, where do you stand on all this? How ridiculous an investigation are we undertaking here? How prepared for disappointment should we be? Because we want to fund our next album with Templar Treasure.
Yeah, yeah. Look, and look, I met a guy I met a guy in Bradford in 2018 at the book festival there who came up to me and he claimed that he had the Holy Grail. And I didn't take him seriously, and the History Channel ended up commissioning two seasons with him and his mates who had all these treasures. So I was the one who ended up looking silly there. I could have been involved in that series, and I snubbed him. But Temple Dinsley, I'm going to be honest with you, hand on heart, I don't know a whole lot about it. Baldock, yeah, I did. If you go to my blog, templarnight.com, you'll see that I've written about Baldock and this story about it, Baldock being Baghdad, which I just think is hilarious. This idea of the Templars calling
Well,
Baldock.
especially if you've seen Bulldog now. If you compare Bulldog in its glory days to the glory days of the Baghdad Caliphate, slight difference in scale.
Yeah, but look, I mean, there's a chance that the Templars brought back relics from Jerusalem. They were sitting there pretty for just under 100 years on the Temple Mount. That was where the Temple of Solomon was based. They did have a lot of relics, and frankly, your odds of finding something are as good as anybody else's odds. I think there's a lot to be said for enthusiasm, a lot to be said for, dedication to the cause. And who knows, there may be a hand of the Templars that guides you down the centuries to finding something. I say, God with you, go for it.
Excellent. Thank you, Tony. Is there anything you'd like to end on? Anything you feel we haven't covered? Or any plugs you'd like to do? Of course, when we put the video out, we will put links to all your stuff and images of the book and all that as well. So
No, I think the only thing I'd like to is just very quickly is when did you start being interested?
well, so have you seen any of the other videos that we've done?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we started with sort of UFOs, then we went to folklore. And now what we wanted to do was actually we were investigating different history options around here. We even looked at big cats because obviously there's the craze of mysterious big cats being sighted around Britain. But in the end, we settled on the Templar thing. I think because we all have an interest in different parts of history, and they tie in, they exist in this like historical melting pot. Just after a little while after the fall of the Roman Empire, but Byzantium's still going. You've got the papacies getting more and more powerful. So it's like this melting pot of interesting stuff, and the Templars become a way of understanding a lot of the other things that are going on. If you follow the Templar story, by reading your book, for example, I got a much greater sense of what the Crusades really were, of the psychology of that kind of thing. And then we just have the benefit of really it was learning about these tunnels in Hartford. It's something that comes up every few years, like a different person's like, oh, maybe we'll try and find them. Nothing's been found. And to be honest with you, I think the chances that we find I think the origin of this particular Templar story is a local hoax, to be honest. But
Mm.
it's one that's inspired a lot of interest and history. And so I think by exploring this, we then get to explore all these other things, which hopefully will be interesting to people.
I mean, what despite all the kind of different theories, and some of them are crazy, kind of like the Templars going to Atlantis and all sorts of weird stuff that are out there. But you know what? In the end of the day, the Templars did exist. They wear this really kind of charismatic military organization dedicated to Christ. And in your community, I mean, we know in Baldock, Temple Disley, they were there. I mean, it's not a myth. And we also know that right at the end, they were accused of appalling crimes. That's true. There's no way. And so Templars in England, where you live, were rounded up and arrested. I went to somewhere in Lincolnshire. It's a tower in the middle of a field where the Grand Master of England was actually hunted down and taken, and eventually ended up dying in the Tower of London. So it happened. The Templars happened. Um, so I think in that sense, just keep that in your mind that, I know there's a mountain of kooky stuff, but drill down. These guys, their white mantles, their red crosses, their military stuff, their swords, their quest in the Holy Land, their Grand Master who ruled over all of them, and then this catastrophic downfall. All of that happened, and it happened in England, as well as everywhere else. They walked our soil.
Yeah, sorry, just to butt in there quick because I know we don't want to keep you too long, Tony. It was just about the question you asked Andy about what sparked the interest as well into the Templars. We've had a discussion, loads of discussion, like everyone has, I imagine, who's into conspiracy about the Ark of the Covenant, this, that, and the other. And there's one author in particular, you probably, I assume, or you might not have heard of him, Alan Wilson, who did like an alternative history of Britain.
Yeah.
The Ark of the Covenant, this, that, and the other. And this is actually how I led on to the Templars, because I thought, a friend of mine actually said, Templars is probably a more feasible alternative or reality history, rather than just looking into like an alternative history of Britain. But you mentioned earlier about King Arthur, the story King Arthur was prevalent in these communities with the Knight Templar at the time, or stories about it. So do you think there's any credence to just like the general claims about connections to like the Holy Land, and like I think there was you might know yourself, the name of the alphabet, the ancient Welsh alphabet that is sometimes implemented in like Middle Eastern history and stuff like that. Is there any sort of snippet you would give your opinion on that alternative British history?
Because Wilson's the bloke who wrote about the Shroud as well. I'm thinking about the right guy. Right? Yeah, I think
He possibly might have done, but I know
that
he did the
might.
Ark of the Covenant, and
Yeah,
he
yeah,
did loads of relics. Basically, he believed that there's a mound in Wales that's set up
yeah,
to the Star of Regulus. I think he
yeah.
said, and that there's still the Ark of the Covenant he believes in Wales to this day.
Yeah. So my kind of my take on King Arthur, which I kind of outlined in the book, is I don't think he was a Roman general. I don't think he was a Dark Ages warlord. I think King Arthur is all about the age of the Templars and the people, because the people who wrote those stories, Chrétien de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, they were alive at the same time as the Templars, and their patrons, the nobles who they worked to, um, were crusaders. They were crusading nobles who crusaded with the Templars. I think the King Arthur story is all about the Templars. It's not about some other era, hundreds of years before. It's about the Templar era. It's Crusader propaganda. And just that interesting fact is that Chrétien de Troyes and Robert de Boron and Wolfram von Eschenbach all mention the Holy Grail, but they don't totally agree what the Holy Grail is. It's Wolfram von Eschenbach who basically says the Templars are guarding it, and Robert de Boron says it's a cup. There's other theories that it was a jewel in the crown of the devil, and that it was a plate, and of course Dan Brown has told us it's the bloodline of Jesus. But that association of the Holy Grail and the Templars has been around now for what, 800 years.
Yeah.
So why was that association made? I don't know. I don't know. But my
So
God,
two thoughts. Sorry to butt in there, Tony.
Gone.
Two thoughts come to mind. One is you talk about the Arthur stories as sort of propaganda. So does this mean that, in a manner of speaking, what we're looking at here is the Arthur stories are almost like in the modern age, if this was going on in the modern age, they'd be like a cartoon about a military unit that were popular, like
Yeah,
like a slightly fictionalized version of a real thing. Is that what we should take,
yeah,
or
yeah.
is
I
that what
think
you
that.
take?
Oh, it's what I take, and I think that they were kind of like these writers. Oh, they're almost like groveling to their patrons, who were like crusaders. It's almost like they're saying, "You're just like King Arthur, and you're on a noble quest for the Grail, and you hang out with the Templars, don't you? Yeah, you do, don't you?" And and that's what I think they're saying in those King Arthur stories. I think it's as simple as that. But that is intriguing them because, of course, the way they depict the Templars and this association of the Grail, leaves some questions that I don't know, we'll ever be able to answer. And we don't have all the Arthurian legends, of course, that were written at that time. They're incomplete, which is even more
Yeah,
infuriating.
you mentioned in the book infuriatingly incomplete.
Yeah, because
It made me think of George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones.
well, yeah, I mean, I suppose some people would say the Arthurian legends. It's like watching Game of Thrones and then thinking Westeros was real. But but there are grains of truth in Westeros, because it does draw on medieval history, and I think the Arthurian legends did draw on the kind of psychology of the Crusaders, and what they were about, and that emphasis on holy relics, and on knights who are guarding those relics, and the fact that they use that word Templizer. It's all very, very tantalizing. Why are they writing about these things?
So, what do you think the Grail was, just out of curiosity? Because you mentioned a few different options,
Yeah.
and do you think it just doesn't exist?
Um, hey, I don't want to shoot the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah.
Of course, it exists.
Of course, it exists, but I think the cup is the chalice is the hell of blood of Christ. To me, is the most obvious one. I find the others slightly too. I mean, the bloodline of Jesus is an interesting one, but I think in the end, there are so many depictions in Christian iconography of that chalice. Um, and it's something that features in a lot of the apocryphal gospels, the gospels that weren't accepted into the Bible, and then a lot of medieval legends as well. But also, it just appeals to me as well. I just love this idea that Joseph of Arimathea, came here with the chalice, the Holy Grail. You know the story as well that Jesus came here to
Yeah, I was
Why
going to
don't you
ask you
share the
about that. Yeah.
story? It's a good story.
I thought he went to
Yeah,
France though.
that Joseph of Arimathea came to England he was actually Jesus's uncle or great uncle. He came to England with Jesus when he was a boy because of those missing years in Jesus' life, after all. And the story in the Middle Ages was that they lived in the village of Priddy in Somerset, and they were basically doing lead and tin mining because Joseph of Arimathea was a tin and lead merchant, basically selling it from the Cornish tin mines and the Somerset lead mines back to the Middle East. Anyway, that was the story. And then basically they go back to the Holy Land. Jesus grows up, does his ministry, is crucified, and a very sad Joseph of Arimathea returns with the blood of Jesus and comes back to Somerset, and then comes to this mysterious island, which we now call Glastonbury, the Isle of Avalon, and buries the chalice, and then it bubbles up red water. If you've ever been to the chalice well in Glastonbury, it's iron oxide, the cynics say. But there you are, it's still bubbling up. Still bubbling up red water, and then of course he struck his staff into the ground, and this tree grew, which was the Glastonbury thorn, which keeps getting chopped down.
Yeah, there was a group that cut that tree down as they believed it was some form of heresy, right?
Well, in the Cromwellian era, in the English Civil War, they cut it down. I think it grew back, and then I think a property developer was the last one that chopped it down. But yeah,
It's
yeah.
always property developers.
That is crazy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's like that poor old sycamore up at the Hadrian's Wall. Same fate. But yeah, yeah.
Yeah, terrible,
It's,
terrible. All right,
hey,
Tony.
gentlemen,
Well, let's say one's.
I've got to go and have my dinner. You've exhausted me.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Tony.
Yeah.
Much appreciated.
It's been a blast.